Well, there you have it. The Supreme Court has struck down affirmative action as unconstitutional. Whether you agree or disagree with this verdict, there is no doubt this result will have a major impact on the college admissions process, and for minorities across the country. I'm not here to debate whether or not this was a good or a bad decision, but it does raise an important conversation about what can be done moving forward. Affirmative action has gone through a great many changes and shifts in policy to support minorities, and I believe it has been these changes which have made something which is widely supported in principle far more controversial than it needs to be. Affirmative action has its origins during the middle of the civil rights movement. In 1961, then President John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order 10925, which instructed federal contractors, quote, to ensure that applicants are treated equally without regard to race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and also established the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. Now we have to understand that the context of this executive order was that people of color, women, and other minorities at this time were heavily restricted, if not outright banned, from getting almost any form of employment which wasn't deemed acceptable for them. Thankfully, through the efforts of the civil rights movement, this norm has, for the most part, been dissolved in the modern day. Since then, implementation of affirmative action has shifted a bit. While the principles around it remain the same, which are to foster a more equitable social playing field for all of us to compete on, its ways of addressing said problems have seen far more controversy. I think it would be safe to assume that nearly all Americans, at least in principle, support creating a system which provides equality of opportunity. America is, at least in theory, obsessed with meritocracy. We want the best to win, no matter who they are or where they come from. We want to give everyone a fair shot to accomplish their goals and know that if they work hard and put the time in, they can do whatever they want. That is the American dream, after all. These statements really shouldn't be controversial, regardless of your political affiliation. So then why is it that affirmative action has raised so much pushback? The modern implementation of affirmative action in schools is essentially paradoxical to its core tenet, to make things more equal. If we allow race or other identities to play a role in college admissions, then it is inherently making the competition of admissions unequal for students applying, even if the attempt to do so is virtuous and based on helping people. While we may support fostering a diverse learning environment, you must understand that for every person who didn't quite qualify but was accepted, someone who was qualified was rejected. And for that to be determined based on checking an identity box is not going to fix any problems or heal any divides in our society. In fact, it will probably only make them worse. Furthermore, I think the assumed results of affirmative action are inherently flawed. The idea is that by providing minorities and impoverished students opportunities at higher education, they will use their knowledge and future income to help rebuild and support their communities, thereby fixing the cycle of systemic poverty and shrinking the racial divide. But this assumption simply ignores the human element in all of this. Most impoverished people who become successful and find social mobility rarely return to their beginnings to set things right. What really ends up happening is that they adopt the tendencies of the social class they moved into, and often are scornful of the impoverished community that they were born into because they see it as having made their life exponentially more difficult than it needed to be. This is why you rarely see the very successful who came from humble beginnings reinvest their huge swaths of wealth back into their respective communities. So what can we do to fix this issue without creating another one? Well, it's safe to say that most, if not all, of inequality which arises in education is due to one thing: money. Impoverished schools, whether they are majority white, black, Latino, etc., are going to produce students of a lower caliber than a school which has sufficient monetary support for its programs. At the end of the day, what we want is all students, regardless of their background, to be able to compete as fairly as possible on their merits. So in order to fix the overall problem, this is where we must start. The most important step is to find a way to decouple school funding coming primarily from property taxes. We must implement a system which provides increased funding for schools in impoverished communities. This alone won't necessarily fix any problems in the short term, but the money should provide opportunities for exceptional students to excel and take more advanced classes to help distinguish themselves from their peers, providing them more pathways for success. There's no way to ensure the success and focus of every student, but this certainly helps to build a solid pathway for those who are driven. Gerrymandering school zones, or zoning, must also be adjusted to stop excluding minorities from more affluent, predominantly white schools. A study conducted by the University of Austin, Texas found that, quote, on average, both school attendance zones and school districts are more gerrymandered to zone out more racially/ethnically dissimilar students in favor of more racially/ethnically similar students. By fixing the gerrymandering and zoning issues, we can naturally foster a more diverse school environment while also improving the education and future livelihoods of all students involved. Finally, we need to emphasize the importance that education provides in lifting people out of poverty. Most people within poor communities turn to gangs or crime as a quick and easy way to try and cope or escape the poverty which they live in. These actions only perpetuate the cycle which exists within said communities and prevents them from ever developing and fostering a more prosperous environment. As long as careless parents and poor role models influence our youth, they will never truly be able to solve the problem. This is why it is so important to address both the external and internal issues simultaneously, as one without the other does not yield any results. Band-aids are not going to fix the issues which reside within our education system. So if we are truly attempting to solve the education gap, which does exist, it is more important to use a bottom-up approach than a top-down one. The end of affirmative action should be a wake-up call that the system in place was too divided and controversial, and that a better system needs to be found with more unanimous support. These issues alone won't fix any of the problems facing impoverished communities immediately, but they will certainly lay the groundwork for improving said communities in the future.